Hi, I'm Mandy Sayer and I'm sitting here in the old Fitzroy Hotel in Woolloomooloo. It's my local pub, and most of the work that I do is set in and around Woolloomooloo and King's Cross and Darlinghurst, and a lot of the characters that I meet in this area end up in both my non-fiction and my novels and short stories. I tend to write across genres. My first novel won the Vogel Award a very long time ago. And one of the judges happened to be Thomas Keneally, who is at the centre of this project because of the Mechanics Library School and his association with that. My first novel was basically a fictionalised version of my childhood, and part of it was set up here in King's Cross in Victoria Street. And it was inspired by my family circumstances. We grew up very poor, just up the street in Victoria Street. We lived in one room. There were 5 people in one room, and often we had no money and would have to eat tomatoes, raw tomatoes for dinner, or we'd have to scratch around and search for change in the room to scrape together enough money to buy lunch. These are the circumstances in which I grew up. I went to 12 public schools in 3 states. I've lived in women's refuges. I've been homeless. I've suffered a lot of domestic violence as a child, and all of these experiences have contributed to my attraction to the working class of Australia and also the welfare class of Australia. They tend not to be written about very much, and I find that they're a really great source of material, and these communities make me examine human nature in a different way. I've written about 6 works of fiction, 6 works of non-fiction, and my most recent book was Australian Gypsies, Their Secret History. It's the first book on Romany Gypsies in Australia. Currently there are about at least 50,000 Gypsies living in Australia, and their stories have never been told, their history has never been told. There were 3 convicts on the First Fleet who were Gypsies, and they were part of forming the Australia that we know today. One of the Gypsies convicts was James Squire, Australia's first beer brewer, and I spent about 2 years travelling around Australia, living with Romany Gypsies, recording their stories and learning about their culture. They're the most generous people that I've ever met. Once you gain their trust, you're friends for life and you're part of the family. One of my attractions to writing about misfits and outsiders and people who don't necessarily ordinarily get into Australian literature is because my father was a great storyteller, fabulous storyteller, but he was illiterate. He didn't know how to read or write. He could sign his own name, but he found it difficult to write anything more than that, and he found it very challenging to read. Growing up and hearing his stories, I began to record them myself, and this was part of my early writing apprenticeship, would be recording his stories, so I could keep them. After he died, I had a record of this lost history. The stories would go with him if I didn't record them. These stories ended up getting into a memoir called Dreamtime Alice, about the time he and I travelled around the United States performing on the streets. He was playing the drums, I was tap dancing, and one of my motivations for going on this trip with him, which lasted 3 years, was because I wanted to become a part of his stories, a part of his history, to be represented in them. But what I found after having written the book is that he also became part of my story as well. So that was quite moving. But growing up with an illiterate father in a very working class family has influenced me a lot, and it informs all my work. My next book, which is coming out in October, is called Misfits and Me, and a lot of the pieces are about this community here, this working class and housing commission community, how they stick together, how they help one another, how they support one another, how they get to go around the status quo and make meaningful lives out of the smallest material. And so I'd just like to thank the people who end up in my work for putting up with me. And I'd also like to thank the Sydney Mechanics Library for allowing me to give this little talk.